Thank you for organizing this event and for your kind introduction, inviting me to speak on subject of cultural asymmetry and peaceful relations and coexistence in Western societies. Let me begin with a couple of apposite comments about my perspective. One is that, I take very seriously the comment of Maharishi Sri Aurobindo, who suggested that we should not hold back in what we think and say because of embarrassment. So that's the first thing, that I'm disinclined to be hesitant because of what people might feel. And secondly, more general point, which will be explicit in my talk later if we have enough time, is that much of Western social science and its precursor in the 19th century, historians actually, they have always been aspects of state policy, and state policy in a very large sense is about warfare. So I actually have no surprise that Western historians and their friends in India who work in places like Columbia, Harvard, Chicago, and all these places are completely at one with them in their critique of India. The historians, anthropologists, and sociologists in the main. Economics, which I partly taught, is also actually significantly an ideological science. And if you just read the preface to the most famous economics text of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes's General Theory, in that just preface, he will tell you that this was a political tract. So the fact that Western academia is hostile to India may disappoint us because we expect more, foolishly, I think, but it is to be expected. So nothing surprises me. Also notice at the moment the way Ukraine is being reported in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Europe. There is no respect for truth whatsoever. Even basic things are simply not even discussed. So all of this we should bear in mind in the reporting of India, because India is one of the three targets of the United States, Britain, and somewhat French and German too, for breakup. Russia is target number one, India is target number two. So if Russia goes down, we are next. And China, of course, is there, but that's a harder nut to crack. But anyway, let me now proceed to the talk. Let me talk first about Leicester and Birmingham, because that is what I think interests many people. And I will, if I have time, contextualize that with some broader historical perspective. Two issues I flag in advance, and I hope Prakashji will acknowledge this, as he pointed this out to me, that multicultural in the sense of common sense popular usage is not actually what it means in greater intellectual depth, because it is a more complex term. So I'm going to be using it in the sense of popular usage. And the other thing that in my writing came out, that I began to use asymmetry and difference interchangeably. So don't let that worry you. And finally, when I began thinking about this, I was thinking like an activist. But unfortunately for people like me, who is from academia, once I start writing about it, I'm constrained and I begin to reflect. And the dialogue and discourse changes a little bit. Not too much, I hope. Now, asymmetry in human society is absolutely normal. Difference is there always. And why this is so is not an interesting question. We could have a different seminar for this, but difference is normal. And there is friction when these differences come up against each other. And historically, the critical factor in societal consequences of these asymmetries depends on the extent of the differences among the constituent groups who are in that society. So difference is normal, and the friction, the seriousness of the friction really derives from how big are the differences. Let me, as an aside, say something to give you food for thought straight away. differences also can get completely dissolved and disappear. For example, in my view, the immigrants from the mainland of Europe who've come here since Britain joined the European Union, and particularly since 1990s when there was freedom of movement for labor, these European immigrants, by the third generation, actually will be assimilated. They will become mainly anglicized, and they will not be visibly different. Perhaps only superficial distinctions will be some of the food habits and the names they have. For example, you may not know that someone like Michael Howard, very English, he is actually from Eastern Europe. And there are many, many others who are very, very much from the Eastern European part of the world who are completely assimilated. I think that will happen to the people who come from Poland and Hungary and Romania by the third generation. But let me now come to the 4 newer groups who came to the United Kingdom in the 1950s. And the issue is much more complicated in their case because of the issue of color. Not only was there difference in their cultural backdrops, but color was a key issue. So, of course, in the case of the West Indians, they happened to be Christian, though of a different color, and that actually provoked a hostile reaction to them, as we all know. There were riots in Notting Hill and elsewhere. But my impression is, and I've lived here for a very long time now, over 50 years, is that the West Indians have been intermarrying on a rather large scale. And I get the feeling that they will become racially assimilated eventually. I think they may actually pretty much disappear. That they will no longer be visible racially as too distinct. Somewhat, but there are many Europeans from earlier generations who have Black African genes. But of course, the Black Africans are a bit different from the West Indians because they are both Muslim and Christian. And there are significant differences between them, i.e. from North Africa or from, say, East Africa. But let that pass because we don't have time for discussing that. I'm giving this as backdrop to understand where we are at now. The 3 other groups really are South Asian, Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims. I'm going to ignore Muslims from other parts of the world, and there are quite a few now, say from Somalia. And asymmetry is a conspicuous issue where South Asian Muslims are concerned and others too. Let me make you sit up by saying, there is actually quite a considerable degree of socialization of the South Asians, of all backgrounds taking place, including Muslims. Though fewer of them, but there is socialization taking place, and there is actually growing and significant levels of interracial marriage and liaisons also. So the situation will become very much more complicated. The only thing I'll say is that those who are the products of interracial marriage, that is one parent is white, they get assimilated by the time they're 25, they're totally assimilated. I mean, many of my friends who tell me in Birmingham they grew up with half Pakistani children, but have never met them socially since they left school. In marriages or other events, they become totally assimilated for reasons which are very clear. They're very light-skinned, and being light-skinned is a big advantage over here, and you don't want to flaunt your antecedents in that case. Indeed, our Home Secretary, the esteemed Suella Braverman, is a mixed Tamil Goan heritage, and from Kenya and Mauritius. That's as diverse as one's ethnic and cultural mix could be. But I will have a comment on this phenomenon too. Hindus from South Asia are barely visible. For example, there are lots of Bengalis in London. I almost never meet them except perhaps very briefly in Durga Puja, where their wives are wearing saris and they are being very Bengali Hindu, but that's the only time. They are not visible otherwise, socially or professionally, they're not visible. Much of the social visibility and political visibility is that of people who migrate from East Africa. Sikhs are the only group from South Asia who have some outward socio-political footprint, but their presence is also relatively uncontroversial unless you bring up the issue of India. So their footprint is also actually relatively innocuous. So Hindus from South Asia, I don't see them registering very much on the horizon. Those from East Africa are much more active socially, politically, and in business, and they are more active. Those who are in this cohort, this group, They definitely have socio-cultural differences, but tensions with the host community are largely absent. Please remind me if I missed something in Leicester of a riot between white people and people from East Africa, because I live in the outskirts of Harrow and I've never heard of any issues. I'm afraid you may be upset to hear that, in my view, they have accepted their racial subalternity, that they are subordinate. They have implicitly accepted that. They don't make a fuss. And I meet a lot of people who tell me, what racism? I've never encountered it. I also meet some who will disagree with that. But I'm shocked when I meet people who say, I'm an Asian, but I've never encountered racism. A lot of the people do say that. They have adapted. They have gone into independent businesses, which reduces the scope of frictional interaction. And they live relatively unobtrusively. I'll tell you as an aside, when I moved into my street in Stanmore, Northwest London, I think I was the only non-white person in the street. This is not very long ago, 2006. And my neighbors were a little bit wary and anxious, but they were very reassured when they found out I was a Hindu. They were okay with that. And they've been very all right ever since. So that's an interesting aside. Asians settle for very little, provided white people come to their chai and samosa for their festivals. And others are completely socialized. They are caricatures of Asian, and we see them now in the British cabinet. These people are only nominal Asians. That, I believe, lost somebody, the Labour Party whip was saying that about OAC Kwarteng. But in the case of the Asians, I can say that I've got nothing to lose. And these are people who are basically only Asian in name. However, many South Asian Muslims are distinctive, and they are seeking to maintain their identity and subscribe to Islamic precepts. But even in this group, there is a degree of integration taking place, and we should not underestimate that. And I'm told by some of my Muslim acquaintances and friends in Birmingham, a lot of interracial marriage is taking place. Now it begins to achieve a critical mass at some point. So let's not ignore that there is assimilation even in this group. Still, a significant number of South Asian Muslims, which really means Pakistanis, especially men, tenaciously retain their Islamic identity. So much of their claimed adherence to Islam, actually, if you look deeply, is idiosyncratic. If you compare their lifestyle with what happens in Arab countries, there is a lot of dissimilarity. For example, in places like Tunisia, hijab is virtually banned in public spaces, schools, and many other similar things which are not done in the original Islamic spaces. People here think are absolutely critical to being a Muslim. So this is all a little bit confusing. One critical factor in the stability of this sense of Islamic identity in this significant cohort, socialization notwithstanding, is that they're marrying people from Pakistan. So there is a continuity in the renewal of their Islamic identity, or what they regard as their Muslim identity. What are the issues that arise with this important segment who claim to be conforming to the injunctions of the Quran, Sharia, and Sunnah? Because all of these lead to some patterns of abhorrent conduct, and these are major cultural differences of the kind I mentioned at the beginning, which cannot be negotiated easily because the difference is too large, particularly in the context of the Christian and secular culture of the United Kingdom, elsewhere in Europe, France, Germany, and the Low Countries. All of these areas are having serious problems, and we can see the reaction, particularly recently in Italy and Sweden now, that people are unhappy and there is a backlash. So these differences are leading to serious problems. Now, you can't say, oh, it only happened in one little place in Birmingham and Leicester, and the Hindus were to blame anyway. No, there's a bigger problem. Let me summarize some of the issues which make for distinctive manifestations of Islamic traditions and practices. Now, these may not enjoy universal support among Muslims, and I really don't want to point a finger at everyone, but I'm afraid insofar as they are occurring, they are an issue. And besides, when you do surveys, many Muslims who won't say so publicly in private, the surveyor will say, oh, no, we agree with these things. What are these things which are a real source of difference, which is impossible to negotiate? Forced marriages, Honor killings. When honor killings were being reported about 15 years ago, the newspapers kept saying, oh, South Asian phenomenon. And then I believe Lord Bhikkhu Parekh, who was a really establishment South Asian, protested. They could not find one instance of a Hindu honor killing in England. There were a few Sikh cases, but very, very few. So they stopped doing that. Honor killings. Nikah halala. I don't know how widespread that is, but I think you won't get to hear about it because it's so deeply shameful. Banning of school sex education, segregation of the sexes in public spaces, and female circumcision. I believe there's been one prosecution for female circumcision, which is illegal in this country, but of course, the authorities don't want to meddle too much. One major issue that has been very much in the media of late, the last few years, is the grooming of young white teenagers, mainly, but Sikhs and Hindus too as well, by Pakistani men. Almost 99.9% of these people are Pakistani men. And it is across the country, which is a bit shocking that you hear about this as far as Oxford, parts of London. This is not a restricted phenomenon to do with a small number of people. It's a serious issue. Let me give you an explanation of why I think this is happening, at least a part explanation. It's because, in Muslim communities, women are segregated from the men, particularly when they're teenagers after menstruation, they're all segregated. So Muslim men are looking for female company, and they look for available white women, particularly those in care, vulnerable, less familiar with the real world. And in any case, they regard them as people of very low morals and not worthy of respect. And some of the Muslims who have been convicted in the courts of rape actually said that in court. The big problem with this is implicitly, whenever we hear Muslim spokesmen, they are basically saying our practices are non-negotiable. Now, this is a very serious issue because in liberal societies, this is an impossible dilemma since mutual compromise defines the essence of a liberal society. So on the one hand, people are saying non-negotiable. And anybody from India will know everything which comes up is non-negotiable. There is sartan se juda if you dare to challenge. Even if you simply repeat what's in the Quran, there is sartan se juda. There is also the abhorrent conduct of Muslims who are willing to engage in terrorist violence in response actually to atrocities against Muslims in other countries by Western governments. I'm not going to contest this because I know this to be true. Western governments have committed horrendous killings across the Muslim world. 3 million Iraq, 2 million Syria. There is nothing to debate on this question. But the Muslims here are killing innocent people in their midst. And the only argument I would make, that there should be some thought in any group that whatever the other side does, I will not target innocent people. But that is what happens when the terrorists plant bombs. And this is partly why Britain has a population, Muslim population of 4%, but 17% of the prison population are Muslims, and that costs about 45,000 pounds a year to maintain. If you look at the data, Hindus are not in the percentage figures. The total numbers are so small, they don't actually figure. Maybe they're too smart to be caught, but nevertheless, they're not even in the data. But let me add, this is the academic part of my perspective on the whole issue. I do not think Muslims are outside history, that they will forever follow the dictates of their religion in their daily lives and choices. This is not the case. It has never been the case with any community. Islam has differed in time and space in Arab countries. There were secular movements which were all destroyed by Western governments. And it was mainly sponsored by the British and the French, and then the Americans took over in the 50s. All secular nationalist movements in the Arab world were destroyed by Western governments. And even today, the numbers of Muslims leaving the faith, the apostates, are actually quite numerous. Many actually are afraid to come out in the open, not just because they fear for their personal safety, but when you do that, you lose all your family and friends completely. And I know of individuals who actually were totally ostracized from the community. Now, that's a big deal. Think about your fate, everybody in your community boycotts you. Now that happens. So the numbers may be higher. Now look at Iran. Look at these brave women in their teens, including this young woman of 17 beaten to death, and others, 185 dead. Good number of them are young women. They're all laying down to refuse any more Islamic persecution. This is a republic where 70-year-old girls were being hanged from cranes because they were cheeky with the judge. You don't believe me? Google on the internet. This is the criminal organization. We used to think the Shah was terrible, but my God, what we got in this place is worse. Why has traditional Islam nevertheless survived? That's because, Islam has been an ally of the West from the 1860s when the British helped to create the Deobandis, and then in the 1880s, the Ahmadiyas, who were really the king's party, the British party of Islam. And this was done to marginalize Hindus who were considered to be a problem because they were asserting their rights, and of course, by the 1890s, demanding relative freedom, etc., etc. And theocratic Islam has been used to suppress, as I said, nationalist and unity movements in the Arab world. And the West has implanted conservative monarchies and protects them. In the UAE, Qatar, Saudi, no, of course, the Americans are saying they may leave Saudi. But that is why we have conservative Islam being renewed constantly. And in fact, Salman bin, the ruler of Saudi, has said, oh, we spread it around the world because the Americans said we should do it. Again, Google, he said that, Mohammed bin Salman, that, the Americans said we should spread Wahhabi Islam around the world. I think they were particularly targeting Russia and India. Why is the West doing this? If you read any of the standard histories, in the beginning, it was all about oil. But now it's about oil and gas. And they've used Muslims against Hindu India from the very beginning. And of course, they used them in Chechnya against the Russians because Chechnya was like Kuwait. All the junction of oil pipes went through Chechnya. So they wanted to cut the Russians off from that. So all of this is very mundane, very imperialist, very much to do with Western domination. And do you know now? The American government is paying $1,000, $1,200 to Al Qaeda and ISIS fighters to go and fight against Russia and Ukraine. Look at the redacted account of this. They are paying ISIS, the enslavers of women, to go and fight. Now we know where ISIS came from. It was very much an American project. The recent violence has been blamed. That is the violence in Leicester and Birmingham, Narendra Modi. And we are all upset thinking, no, this is completely false. It's so unfair, it's far-fetched. Actually, this is not true. Narendra Modi is responsible, but in a different way. These riots are part of a larger global conspiracy to discredit Narendra Modi and the Indian government, to destabilize him. They want to create enough trouble in India to force him out of office, perhaps even worse. But unfortunately for them, Narendra Modi remains very popular. In fact, in my view, you can criticize some policies of this government since 2014, and I also have done so. But believe you me, he's the most important Hindu leader we've had since Chhatrapati Shivaji was crowned in 1676. This is a turning point for us. Only major consolidation and expansion remains. So I understand why they don't like Narendra Modi. And believe me, it is him more than anybody else who is galvanizing and trying to consolidate. Now people say, oh, but ye nahi kiya, wo nahi kiya. Yeah, bilkul sahi baat hai. Ye nahi kiya, wo nahi kiya. All is true. The temples are with the government. But I'm enough of a historian to know if any government achieves 5 of its goals, it is considered a success. So that's fine. Last week, somebody sent me a poster in the Wall Street Journal abusing Indian ministers like Nirmala Sitharaman, who'd gone there for the IMF meeting, virtually saying, arrest them. This is how far the campaign has gone. British Home Secretary Suella Braverman's intervention falls into the same pattern. It's part of the same story of discrediting the government of India. This is a prelude to the kind of sanctions they've used against Russia. And they will use exactly this total economic war against India at some point in the future. And they'll say, this government is a violator of minority rights, gender rights. And look in the Financial Times, utter nonsense about lack of press freedom. Completely false. You open the TV day in, day out, they're abusing Narendra Modi. Day in, day out, they're abusing the government. Nobody stops them. But the Home Secretary's puzzling speech about bona fide Indian immigrants for riots, they were almost completely on the receiving end, makes sense in this context. Instead of saying she will protect them and deter the rioters, she effectively said the rioters had cause to riot. That's what it implied from what he said, that too many people came and raised problems. You are here legally. You don't have to then answer why you're here. You are here as a lawful resident or citizen. But she said you are responsible for riots. Now that also is factually incorrect. I fear this inquiry will whitewash what happened because they don't dare offend the Muslims. They are, first of all, they're allies. Secondly, they're scared. But some little fellow will get angry, sit in his bedroom, in his bedsit or wherever, look up on the internet how to make a bomb, and they will do a Manchester arena. So these people are also dead scared. So Hindus are bakra, useful scapegoats. I will not be able to talk about the historical backdrop, so let me quickly go through this. The specific dynamics of the riots need to be understood quickly. They have always been riots for generations. Whenever Hindu processions, religious processions came anywhere near a mosque or Muslim areas. Because the Muslim idea is you must control the territory where you live. So they will not allow it because it is a fundamental tenet of Islam, control over territory. It doesn't have to be de jure, it has to be de facto. That is why they will always prevent you and they will stone you, they will fight with you. And of course, it is underpinned by the idea that we can't allow these kafirs and idolaters to pollute our atmosphere. And there's a third thing, they don't like women who are not properly clad to be walking around their area and corrupting their women. So all of this is of a piece. And these riots are happening in all parts of India right now. This is Durga Puja, Diwali season, many parts of India, West Bengal, Rajasthan, Gujarat maybe, UP. Processions are going through particular areas and they're stoned and they're riots. And the British newspapers, look, they're beating up on Muslim. One Muslim was thrashed wrongly, I believe, by the police for throwing stones. One. And they're saying India is committing genocide against Muslims. So that is why basically the British press is our enemy. Read my lips, enemy. The second thing is, there's a big Nirpuri population in that entire area in the Middle East. And they hate India in general, Narendra Modi in particular, and especially since he amended Articles 370 and 335A in 2019. And this anger is always nearly on the boil, and it translates quickly at any small pretext. So these three things: they don't want you in the area, they're angry with you, and you then march through with a religious procession, which may be your legal right, but you will not please them. I'm going to skip this European part and come to the conclusion. Again, to say British establishment regards Islam as an ally to be cultivated owing to commercial interests. And they're angry with India because India will not play ball. They do not heed their injunctions on Indian foreign policy. Now we see with respect to Russia, because Russia is very important for us. If we try to cut our ties with Russia, the mainstay of the Indian Air Force Sukhoi 30s will be grounded because they need Russian spare parts and Russian maintenance. So we lose 2/3 of our Air Force very quickly. So apart from any other reason, we can't afford to offend. But as I said, we know why the Americans are using Ukraine to destabilize and break up Russia, because we know we are next. So British establishment is a master of dissimulation and deception. They're willing to accept Manchester arena killings and many other bombs as the price of collaboration with Islamic regions. And as I said, they're also scared of them. This is why the media constantly libels India and Hindus, as I said, convenient scapegoat. They are particularly responsible for what happened in Birmingham and Leicester because they have been saying Muslims in India face genocide. There is a lot of evidence to the contrary. I don't want to go through it, but if you can find, there's an hour-and-a-half long discussion, an interview with Madhu Kishwar about Modi and the Muslims. It will make you sit up to find out Modi has really been bending over backwards to Muslims since 2014 and before. Not recently, he has been doing that. Two quick figures. In 2018, 80% of all Indian scholarships went to Muslims who are less than 14% of the population. 80%. Last year, or the year before, Modi in this Pakka home building program built 1,000 flats and houses in Meerut. 800 were given to Muslims. Possibly because they met the criteria. Most important thing is there was no Hindu riot to protest. No Hindus. I heard this in private conversations from people who know Meerut and live there. So Hindus are a very good scapegoat. And Home Secretary has apportioned blame, and I have no faith in the inquiry. And Hindus, I'm afraid, in conclusion, will duly shrug it off once white politicians join them for chai and samosa on their festivals. And some of them get OBEs. I think for an OBE, a lot of Hindus are selling their grandmother and everything. Evidently, being a Hindu by birth does not mean you are actually a Hindu or understand Hindu interests. Because you're busy buying a prosperous life here. And the most controversial thing I'm going to say, I'm afraid I've been here a very long time. I've been a keen observer and I have a lot of friends. Many Hindu organizations and the leaders are constantly in touch with the British authorities, that is the police and home office, many of them. So my trust in a huge number of them is zero. This is what the Indians were doing 200 years with the British, so it's nothing new. So let me conclude by saying, what is my advice to you? And I'm talking, I think, to a significant number of people from East Africa, Gujarati origin, who have the money and the option to buy a second home somewhere in Gujarat for their grandchildren. By the time their grandchildren grow up, India will be a nice, prosperous place. And you may need for them to flee as you did once, as your grandparents did once from Uganda. So let me conclude here. I'm sorry for taking up a little bit more time than I had intended. I will answer any questions about the historical backdrop which I left out. Namaste and thank you for being patient.
Thank you, Gautam ji. That was very, very informative. A lot of things that you contextualize in the historical background were fantastic. I think we have floor in a sense open, but I would request participants to raise their hand so that we can handle the questions in an orderly manner. So
Sunilji, Sunilji, Pravarji has written down a question. Pravarji, could you read out by yourself?
Sure. So thank you, Gautam ji. Really interesting presentation. My question really concerns something you touched on towards the start, but sort of wanted to hear more from you on. And it's this idea of multiculturalism. So my question is there also a fundamental problem with this idea of multiculturalism? Because this multiculturalism that we see in the West today, its premise is that everything goes. Its premise is that there is no universal moral framework, and therefore we cannot, if we uphold this multiculturalism, criticize immoral practices from other traditions. So A, is there a problem with multiculturalism? And B, does India need to show the whole world a better idea of pluralism that allows us to criticize and that allows us to create harmony, and is it equipped to do so?
You know, I think this issue of multiculturalism, which a lot of British right-wingers criticize, is misunderstood completely. There is no problem with multiculturalism, and I use this in the popular sense, since Prakashji is here and he had a very interesting set of comments on this, the use of this term. Where is the problem? Are the Polish people creating a problem? Are the Italians creating a problem? Are the Germans creating a problem? Are the Japanese creating a problem? Are the Hindus creating a problem? Are the Buddhists? There is no problem. The Europeans largely now share some kind of secular Christian backdrop. So they do actually accept norms. For the Hindu case, it is even easier. Our universalist view is that we do things which are appropriate to upholding the universal order. We don't even have fixed rules. The fixed rules change depending on the circumstances. If you read our epics, there are many issues where certain kind of behavior is appropriate, and in other circumstances they're not. So, and I don't see, and I said, I don't know of any riots between Hindus and the English. There's only one group which is having a problem. Only one group. I know of no others. The West Indian problem was a very temporary one, and I said they are not going to be an issue. Multiculturalism works. Britain is the best example in the world, and London most of all has the enormous success of multicultural, where people from all cultures become a melting pot, where they share with each other. Like you, I'm sure, occasionally eat Italian food as I do, French food perhaps a bit less frequently, Chinese. We kind of get along with each other. All my people who come to work in my house are Polish. No issues. Language sometimes. There is only one group. And in the Indian case, this group is hell-bent on subjugation. They have a long-term project. We think about what car we're going to buy, what holiday we're going to. They are thinking, when will Allah be brought to India? Oh, it will take 200 years. We will wait for 200 years. So they have a long-term project. So they will never concede anything. And because after Narendra Modi came, Hindus started becoming a little bit conscious. They actually haven't done very much. They haven't made many demands. Ayodhya, the most important place of worship after almost 500 years, came back. And maybe Kashi, and a couple of others. But that's about it. So they agree with us. Now, in the Indian case, many so-called secular Indians are basically pawns of the West and Islam. So there's nothing to discuss with them. We have to disable them. We have to eliminate them politically. And for that, other Hindus have to wake up. They have to wake up. And specific things they have to do. Re-elect Narendra Modi next time. And re-elect him again, or at least re-elect Yogi Adityanath. We are on the cusp of change. Our main job is to extend and consolidate. We have an opportunity after 1,000 years. And by the way, secular is a totally incorrect term for India because we are a deeply dharmic society. I don't say religious because Islam is mazhab, which is not a religion. It's not a mazhab, it's a political ideology. And we are actually inherently plural because within Hinduism itself, we have multiple sampradayas who disagree with each other, and that's accepted. And all of these sampradayas, Jainism and Sikhism are one, though the British have told them that no, you're different, you're totally different, your religion. This is completely false. We have many sampradayas because this is our way of looking at the world. There are many paths to the truth, which doesn't make each one correct. But we are not going to curtail the discussion amongst people, and we're not going to punish them for it. So yes, India should assert this more strongly, but it only can be done when you have political power. And of course, we have to change the ownership of our temples and change our educational systems, the two things which are still outstanding since Modi came to power.
Gautamji, next question is from Paramar Kumar. He's saying, any thoughts on Sanatani people across global dropping their surname? They have only first name, father name, but no family name. What thoughts could be behind it, and what could be short and long-term implications?
I think, name changing, all these, are symbolic, like the change in names of streets, with which I agree, and cities like Pragyaraj, I agree with that, but these are symbolic. What matters is substantive action on the ground. And to me, the most important outstanding one is freeing of temples from mandirs, from state control, and an effective system for managing them. All of which I have penned down and sent to the government with great care, with some help from people, how we might proceed with this. This is the key issue. All issues. Indian economy is now pretty much unstoppable. You can derail it a little bit here and there. Economy will keep growing. I hope by 9% at least. We are kind of nudging 6.5, 7. I hope we can up. I think it'll happen because all that Modi has done is prepared the ground. So I'm not worried about that, but it's our mandirs which should become the backbone of our social moral and educational culture to revive what we once were and could still be, because our way of looking at the world is so different from that of others.
Another question from Prakash Shahji. If media outlets are blocked to alternative accounts, what means can those who wants to say something different use? Here's another, it's kind of suggestion. My suggestion to look multiculturalism is to consider first, what elements actually compose it in policy? Second, what the theorists have said about it? And third, is there a Islamification of multicultural practice and theory?
Well, this business of being blocked is now a big problem. A lot of people who are innocuous have been blocked by Mr. Agarwal, who heads this in the United States. I think he's in the US or is he in India? But anyway, he is the one in charge, and there is a left-wing lawyer. This is a problem. And at one point during all the controversy last year, I think Republic TV very proudly announced they were launching an alternative. We have to have an alternative because all these platforms are ultimately controlled by the US government. All the knowledge generated in them, discussions are subject to analysis by algorithms to understand the society and what is thinking. So these are all basically intelligence gathering operations in which we cheerfully participate. Now, India has broken away. It has got its own GPS. India is going to have its own 5G. Now we have to do this too. It is not any shortage of money, just a decision and political will, perhaps with a bit of encouragement from government. We have to break away. The Chinese have done that. The Russians have done that. It is our turn now. But we have to have our own platform. Look at the way they are blocking so many people who are talking about the Ukrainian conflict. Overnight, Redact was blocked, and they keep telling you, make sure you have our URL to be able to hear us. So we were to do it. On the question of multiculturalism and universal values on policy, actually, this already exists, the rule of law. The rule of law does not accept many of the things Islam says are integral to our practice, from violence towards marriage, tin talaq, all of that is not accepted, which is why the third question is relevant. We have a universal system, which most people agree with and conform to, but under the threat of Islam, the interpretation of these universal values is, as Prakash Ji, I think, who said, is being Islamicized, at least in practice, if not in theory. Which is why we have only one prosecution for circumcision, which means circumcision is okay. Now they're talking about allowing Sharia courts for certain areas of personal law. Now this sounds like, okay, it won't make any difference, but this is the thin end of the wedge. This is how it all starts. But as I said, Islam, traditional Islam, is an ally of the British government, and they're also afraid. And Hindus are just of no importance because Hindus will never make any fuss. And they will always do a compromise if they get an OB. And I know many people who say, I'm working for an OB. People who are on TV a lot, I say, I'm working towards my OB. So the fault is not out there, the fault is in us. Fault is in us. How much we can operate with honor and make some sacrifices if we have to.
The next question is from Jagdish. Jagdish, could you please ask your question by yourself?
Sure. Namaste. So my question is that this whole, ecosystem to suppress India and, Hinduism, is it primarily the purpose is, religious, that is to expand and convert the entire Hindu community into Islamic or Christianity? Is that the reason? Is it economic, where you are taking the resources and keeping this community subservient for your own economic and peaceful existence, or I would say lavish existence? Or is it something else? Religious, social, political, economic? I'm not able to figure out what is the genesis for this. It's been going on for centuries, but what's the source?
Or
what's the reason?
the source has always been the same and it hasn't changed very much. The first is that, India is a very easy target. It's a very divided society. People who are the DMK are very happy to collaborate with Americans and the Chinese against the Indian government. Mamata Banerjee, West Bengal, same story. So it's a very easy target. We are very vulnerable people. And in fact, Ajit Doval in a speech, that is our national security advisor, was saying very few people were required to conquer us because we were divided. Marathas also lost because they were divided. The British didn't particularly win the wars until the very end, but they found it very easy to divide the Marathas, who actually were much better warriors. They had much better weapons. So that's number one. We are a weak and divided people. And that is what Modi has been trying to change. Very, very important. As a historian of change, I observe this, that he has accomplished this somewhat in UP by breaking the caste vote back. This is a very big deal. For this, I do Shashtang Pranam to Modi ji. That's one. We have to change this. Two, in the 1950s, there was a very famous Canadian High Commissioner in Delhi. I forget his name, but there's a book that he wrote of his time in India. And he says he was having a discussion with the CIA person in the American embassy. And the CIA man was saying, we can't fight another war without Indians, meaning Indian numbers. Now, you bear in mind, when nobody came to the Indian ceremony for the Second World War and only the Russians came, the Russian generals there said, oh, why do we care? The two largest groups who fought in the Second World War, Russians and Indians. So numbers of Indians as resources, soldiers, consumers, and of course, all the clever people, they are spiriting away to California because they've got a wonderful system to force them out. There are no Brahmins below 25 left in Chennai. You find out. They're all in Silicon Valley. So Indian resources, Indian brains, look at the number of CEOs in the United States. So resources to fight, resources to use, and a market. I think Christianity is of no consequence except to the religious people. Christianity is simply a way of getting religious conformity. They think Christians will be more willing to do what we tell them. And when the Kundakulam plant was besieged by protesters, the American consul general in Mumbai sent a telegram which was revealed by WikiLeaks saying, yeah, we had to organize the Christians there to surround and try to stop the nuclear plant because they're not buying nuclear plants from us. So Christians are considered a very important asset in India. Bear in mind, in the 1940s, our great Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru reached out to every Christian organization in India to collaborate with Congress. Every single one said no. They all went to Jinnah. They were told by London to do that. Every single one. And Punjab went to Pakistan because of 3 Christian votes, including that of the Sikh, 98 to 101. And one was the speaker's vote. That is why it went to Pakistan. And the funny part of the story is all 3 of these Christians were thrown out, the speaker was thrown out in no time. So India is vulnerable, India is a resource, and Christianity is a way for controlling India. I mean, this is an old story in Christianity. You know, when the greatest of Christian emperors, Charlemagne, invaded east of the Danube, he killed the first 30,000 people he encountered because they were not Christians. And Christianity was a way of consolidating the empire of Charlemagne. So this is something which Christians have always done. They think Christians will collaborate. And on the whole, they are right. Christian India will be much more willing to bow down and do what they're told.
Okay. If I may be allowed a follow-up question on that?
Yeah, go on. Make
Thank
it
you.
short.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So, we have been, as a culture for millenniums, we have been contented and accommodative. And that has, to some extent, become, and add to that, the lack of integrity of some people that has weakened our society. Now, is it time to change that by taking a big agenda or a bigger agenda to bring people together, like Akhand Bharat or something like that? How do we change this passive, isolation to the active agenda from the Hindu community?
This has to be achieved by both the state and civil society together. All societies, have to become less parochial. if they're to be united. People say, oh, look at the diversity, it's wonderful. Yes, but diversity beyond a certain point means disunity. So you have to integrate India socially, economically, culturally, much more. This is the price you pay for simply surviving as a civilization. We have to become much more together, and some of the things will change. This is why I think that linguistic unity is useful. How it is done is very important. If you try to shove it down people's throats, you'll break India. And I think what is happening now is unfortunate. Linguistic unity is one dimension of this. So we have to unite our country in many, many ways. Now people say, but look, we have survived so long. This is actually very foolish. This is not because, of Sanatana Dharma at all, not because of our faith. Sorry, I don't like the word faith because we don't have faith and belief. We have reason. Because of our structure of our society. You see, every locality, every third village had a different set of adherence to Sanatana Dharma. So if you convert the 3 adjacent villages, the 4th one is not going to convert. You have to convert each one in turn. So whereas the Buddhists, if you convert the leadership, the whole community follows. In the case of Hindu, you have to do it one by one. It's a very tough job. That's the first thing. And the other thing, Hindus don't want to admit, we were also quite numerous compared to other societies. We were big in numbers. So it was much more of a challenge for the Muslims to convert us. And besides, they didn't want to convert everybody. They wanted cheap slave labor. And there are many injunctions against Muslims being made slave labor. So their source of income was enslavement of the Hindu peasantry. So that is why they left it alone by and large. Not everywhere, like in Bengal and northern India and Sindh in Punjab, but in most places. So that is why we survived. And the Christians also didn't make a big effort until the early 19th century to convert, because the East India Company was a bit worried that it would create a backlash. It wasn't as if they weren't doing it. It is completely false to say there was no conversion from the 17th century onward. There was a lot going on. If you read the literature, there was conversion, but not on a big scale. After the 19th century, they opened the floodgates, but actually a lot of conversion did not happen. From the 1816 period to about 1880, I think hardly 70, 80,000 people converted. It has accelerated after independence. After independence, हमारे हिंदू नेताओं ने सबको बुलाया, आप आ जाओ. They gave away Nagaland and Mizoram, which was 99%, 98% Hindu. Now it is 98% Christian. That was Nehru's gift to Reverend Michael Scott, with whom he negotiated. And now we are giving up Punjab to Christianity. And Bengal actually is now Muslim. Both Bengal. West Bengal is a Muslim part of India. It is not Hindu anymore. It is gone. So post-independence, we decided to give up our country.
So unfortunate. Thank you, Gautam.
So Gautamji, another question is not actually, it just hand was raised. Suresh Rajpuraji, could you please ask your question? It looks like he's not there. Okay, Sunilji, please go ahead.
Okay, so Reggie is saying he didn't have any questions, so that's okay, fine. I thought his hand was raised. Once, anyway, Gautamji, really, the time is sort of running off and it's already been 1 hour. We would like to conclude the session, but I just wanted to ask you one last question, which is really what Inc.'s agenda is. How to change this prevailing narrative in academia proactively, because what we have in academia, and as Prakashji's question also alluded to, that challenge we face is this almost intellectual terrorism, that if you try and raise an alternative perspective or propose an alternative idea, you're almost kind of shouted down by academia, which is mainly dominated by left-centric academicians who have built their reputation over the years writing against India, against Hindu culture and so on. So how do you change this proactively? Are there any guidance that you can provide us with your experience?
How to do it is not rocket science. It's actually simple. It'll take some time. That's the only, it'll take time. And the way you do it is look at what the Chinese have done. Chinese academia, now, they're in about 40 of them in the top 100 in the sciences. You look, it's quite shocking. What they did, through government sponsorship, which means funding and personnel, they came to dominate all Chinese studies. All Chinese studies, serious studies, not low quality Hindutva pap that we get, real, all dominated by Chinese in China. So they basically blew away the Western academia. And secondly, if you didn't toe their line, no visa, no research. So if you dominate the discourse in India, this will be cured. That's the first thing. You have to dominate the discourse from India, which is doable. You can't change Harvard. You can't change Oxford. You can't change SOAS. These are controlled by the State Department and the CIA. You can't change them. They will still always be there. But what you can do is that your discourse in your own country will overwhelm them by sheer, and these are the only people who matter. Your own citizens are the only people who matter, really. But we are now importing the discourse from Oxford and Harvard. So that is the first thing. And the second thing is Hindu philanthropists are giving money to Harvard, Oxford, Nottingham, to the very people who are abusing Hindu. Even good Hindus are giving money to Nottingham and Oxford. People I respect have given money. So you have to stop these people. Tata gave $50 million to Harvard. Infosys, Rohan, the son, gave big money to an anti-Hindu academic in Colombia to become the editor of all the Hindu texts. And he says Hinduism is a source of fascism. This is the man who got the money. So we have to take over this discord in India and to crack the whip. So gali doge, so if you give gali, you will not be able to come to do. But we are unduly forgiving. We are also perhaps a little bit anxious at this moment of change. We have to become a little bit stronger. I tell you, once we are $5 trillion, if Modi ji is there, he's a far-sighted man. किसी को थप्पड़ अभी तो थप्पड़ लगाना शुरू किया bit prematurely in my opinion थोड़ा जल्दी थप्पड़ मारने शुरू किया. Once we are 5 trillion and when we are 10 trillion, which is not far away, it takes 14 years at 8% to triple. Tripling 3.2 will be almost 10 trillion. It only takes 14 years at 8%. 8% is within shouting distance, bilkul achievable, and it will happen. Then we will see. But we have to lay the groundwork because the change will take time. And I actually, with Prakashji, I've discussed, I have a plan of a shortcut of how to change it in India. It will only cost 10 crores over 3 years to change social science education in universities. 10 crores in 3 years to make a change. And this is the way we have to go. And maybe there's somebody listening with lots of money who will want to have a discussion about this possibility.
Sure. There are many more interesting points being mentioned on the chat. One by Sanjoy Nayak, that the unit of analysis could be constructed as Abrahamic versus non-Abrahamic. Then it's easy to understand why there is collaboration between these two religions against indigenous faiths like Hindus. This collaboration also, he believes, led to the division of India. The analysis should not be restricted only to cultural and religious issues. People living in extreme poverty are also Hindus, just as Adanis and Ambanis. Of course, the debate could go on. Hemaji is saying that the state of some of the government universities is not good. And when you